Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. We're really excited to be here with you. I am Brandon Vaught. I'm the content director at Word on Fire, and with me is Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, happy Easter to you.
Brandon, happy Easter to you and your family, and it's always a delight to be on with you.
Now, this is your first Easter as a bishop. How's that been so far? How's the Easter season going?
It was great. I was down during Holy Week. I was at the LA Cathedral to give a couple talks on Divine Mercy. And then on Chrism Day, so Monday of Holy Week, I gave a talk to all the priests of LA. And I talked about the spiritual life and priest, prophet, king, various things. Then I came back up to Santa Barbara for the Triduum. And I was in 3 different places for Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter Sunday. So I had a ball. It was great fun, especially Holy Thursday. I was down at the Bonaventure Mission, one of the old Padre Serra missions. And we did the liturgy, but then we processed with the Blessed Sacrament out into the streets of Ventura. So I always love public displays of religion. And to be in that church, which Serra, well, it was rebuilt from his time, but it's the same spot where Padre Serra founded his mission. I always find that really moving.
Now, we're here in the Easter season. For us Catholics, Easter just isn't a day. It extends all the way through Pentecost. Tell us a little bit about the centrality of the resurrection for Easter. You know, when you read the scriptures, especially the writings of St. Paul, it's always resurrection, resurrection, resurrection. Yeah. Why this incessant focus on this one event?
Well, first of all, you're right. It's the be-all and the end-all of Christianity. I mean, you could pick out elements of the Christian religion and say, oh, those are good and true and noble and so on. But if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then Christianity is a joke. It's a fraud. And Paul knew that when he said, if Christ didn't rise from the dead, all of my preaching's in vain. I mean, everything he did, every talk he gave, every journey he made was in vain. And furthermore, he said, we're the most pitiable of people if he didn't rise from the dead. Now, again, I go back to Paul to answer your second question. Why is it so central? He said the resurrection is God's yes to all the promises made to Israel. So now go back over Israelite history, because we always have to read Jesus katatagrapha, according to the writings. Don't read him abstractly. Then you'll turn him into a philosopher or a moral teacher. Read him according to the teachings, the writings. And what do you find? You find that God has been forming a holy people, trying to bring it to the point of being truly a priestly people, a kingly people. Through Israel, God wanted to unite the whole human race to himself. That was the purpose of it. But Israel was imperfect in its realization of this mission. Who is Jesus but Israel at its best, meeting the divine love? It's Yahweh meeting finally his faithful people. What's the resurrection but the capstone of this whole process? It's the great yes of God to all the promises he made Israel. I will give you a land, he promises. Well, they came to realize it didn't mean just this patch of earth at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. It meant the land of Jesus' own body. It meant, to be a member of the church, of his mystical body. God promised Israel life, Well, they found out what that meant. It meant life on high with God. Yahweh promises Israel the conquest of its enemies. Well, they realized that happened weirdly through the cross, whereby the enemies of Israel seemed to overwhelm this great representative. But in fact, now through the mystical power of his body, the church, he's bringing all the enemies of Israel to the God of Israel, et cetera, et cetera. See? So I would stay with Paul. The resurrection is God's yes to all the promises made to Israel, which is why if he didn't rise from the dead, we don't have that divine yes. Then Israel remains a sort of unfinished story. It remains a prophecy without fulfillment. So the resurrection is the capstone, the culmination, or use Irenaeus' language, it's the recapitulation of the whole history of Israel. That's why it's so central.
I've had many friends of mine wonder why Jesus wasn't more clear during his ministry with his friends and his followers that he was going to rise from the dead. He never sort of just comes out and says, hey, on the third day after I'm crucified, I'm going to be resurrected. Why do you think Jesus sort of kept this event, which you describe as the capstone, somewhat shrouded even among his closest friends?
Well, yeah, I mean, I hesitate a little bit to say he never talked about it. Think of when they came down from the Mount of Transfiguration, it says they wondered what resurrection from the dead would mean. Or when he tells Peter after the confession that the Son of Man will be rejected and turned over and so on and so forth, but then on the third day would rise. I mean, so I think he did hint at it, certainly. I'll say this, following N.T. Wright here, that the resurrection is not what they were expecting. They were expecting the fulfillment of Israel somehow, and most of them thought of it in terms of the reemergence of a Davidic king who would put Israel's enemies, to rights and would reestablish the earthly kingdom of Israel. But what they saw in Jesus was, yes, it was fulfilled, but in the most unexpected way. It might be true that in fact, I'd say it is true, they didn't quite get it. When he hinted at it, they didn't know what he was talking about. And so in some ways it might have been just a waste of breath and time to be explaining in great detail something that they wouldn't get. After the resurrection, now look at someone like Paul. After he saw the risen Jesus, he didn't right away commence his missionary career. Instead, he went to Arabia, for years. And I always think what he was trying to do was figure it out. Like, what in the world? What does this mean? And then he did figure it out. And what we got from that was the Christian gospel, what Paul figured out about what the death and resurrection of Jesus meant for Israel and therefore for the world. So I think it's the fulfillment indeed of Israel, but in the most unexpected way.
You mentioned the great Anglican scholar N.T. Wright. I'm reading right now through his masterful book called The Resurrection of the Son of God, which is meticulous and comprehensive. It goes over the history of dying and rising gods and the pagan myths and all this other stuff. But one of the most fascinating parts of the book is he distinguishes between resurrection, which is what happened to Jesus, and a couple other forms of dying and coming back to life, including reincarnation and resuscitation. What are the differences between these, and what's unique about resurrection? Why is it important to say Jesus was resurrected and not just resuscitated?
Yeah, and you're touching on so many complex themes, and it's funny as time goes by and as the objections to Christianity come and go, we have to answer different sides of the question. The two things you mentioned, so reincarnation or resuscitation, mean in some way a return to this life. So if reincarnation is right, then a soul leaves a body only to come back and enter another body, which then dies and then it comes again. And it's part of that sort of Eastern eternal return of the same sort of philosophy, which is repugnant to a biblical view, which is very goal-oriented, and history is going somewhere. It's coming to an end and to a climax. The Eastern philosophies tend to have a kind of circular or cyclical sense of life and being. So resurrection doesn't mean that, like just a return to this life. The same with resuscitation. If someone died, and let's say they even had a near-death experience, the soul, if you want, left the body, but then the person was revived, resuscitated, and he comes back to life in this world. Let's say Lazarus, or the daughter of Jairus, or the son of the widow of Naim. Fine, that's resuscitation. And actually it happens because of our medical skill a lot now. A lot of people are resuscitated. That's a return to this life. The resurrection is not just that. It's a lifting up and transfiguration of this life into a higher pitch. It's not a repudiation of the body, but a justification, transformation, elevation of the body to a new and higher pitch of existence. That's what they sensed in the resurrection of Jesus. See, if it was just resuscitation, why wouldn't Lazarus be the Son of God? Say, well, hey, Lazarus, he came back from the dead. Why aren't we worshiping the daughter of Jairus who came back from the dead? It's not just that. It's something qualitatively different.
When Jesus returns in his resurrected body to his disciples, he still has the wounds of the crucifixion. Why, if Jesus is raised from the dead, is he not raised in a body that is perfect and has no display of any deterioration?
Well, I think one thing was to establish as clearly as possible the continuity between the Jesus whom they knew and the resurrected Jesus. The wounds are a sign of continuity. But secondly, those wounds are so important, aren't they? Because it shows that identification with human suffering belongs to the very nature of the incarnate Son of God. So even in the heavenly realm, he bears in his own body the marks of his identification with our suffering, which makes him, as the letter of the Hebrews says, this faithful high priest who knows, was tempted in every way that we are, didn't sin, who knows our suffering, was made perfect through suffering, all of that. The wounds signal that reality, it seems to me. We all know the famous story about Teresa of Avila when the devil appeared to her in the guise of Jesus, and she saw right through him, and he wondered why. And she said, because you have no wounds. And that's a sign that we're not dealing with the true Christ. It's this Jesus whom they knew, this Jesus who was nailed to a cross, who was risen from the dead, not someone else or something else. I'm always moved, when we heard on Easter Sunday the great charismatic sermon of St. Peter on Pentecost. And Peter says, we're witnesses to this. We who ate and drank with him after his resurrection from the dead. And I told the people, I said, that line just sort of flies by our consciousness, but man, that's breathtaking. Here's this Peter whom we can identify. His body, the remains of it, lie under St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which you can see to this day. And he knew Jesus. He knew this Galilean carpenter. And he said, we ate and drank with him after his resurrection from the dead. I find that staggering, It's this Jesus, and the wounds ground him in the reality that he had before the resurrection.
Let's now look at some of the fashionable alternatives that are proposed by skeptics to cast doubt on the resurrection. So one of the most famous ones is the so-called hallucination theory. So what is this, and what are some of the holes in it?
Well, yeah, we know about hallucinations, but so did they. There's a kind of modernist prejudice that says, ancient people were just, gullible. They fell for anything. They believed ghost stories and all this. Read the Gospels carefully, and you'll see they were just as aware of these things and just as skeptical of them as we are. They were pre-scientific, but they weren't stupid, The hallucination theory would say that, these poor things, they were all traumatized and by the death of Jesus, and so they had these hallucinatory experiences of his presence, and they naively, affirmed thereby his resurrection. Well, here's an immediate problem with it, is you'd have to hold to repeated and group hallucinations over a long period of time. So one person having an hallucination, okay, maybe. 2, 3, 4, 12, 500 at once, as we hear Paul say. Paul, many months later, Paul, who was persecuting Jesus, had no vested interest in prolonging his message. And yet Paul has this vivid experience of the resurrection. So to me, it really strains credulity to say that hallucinations were happening over and over and again to various people at various times. I think that's a debunking that ought to be debunked.
And also the hallucination theory fails to account for the empty tomb, which is one of the most widely attested historical facts about Jesus.
Quite right, yeah. They always say the two things you really need are the empty tomb and the appearances, that one or the other wouldn't do it. But when the two come together, there's an extraordinary explanatory force. One without the other, maybe, but the two of them together.
How about the suggestion that Jesus' resurrection is really a symbol or a metaphor that Jesus' cause goes on and that we remember him in our hearts?
Yeah, and that's a real common theory. In the last really 200 years or more, it's been around for a long time. It was certainly revived in the mid to late 20th century in Protestant circles, then in Catholic circles. When I was coming of age, a lot of the major theologians, I think of Skilebex comes to mind. Rahner in his own way, I wouldn't want to overstate that, but someone like James Carroll comes to mind. Roger Haight, certainly, who was very influential at one time. They all would have versions of that, that disciples got together after the terrible death of Jesus. They remembered how powerful his teaching was. They realized that through them, his cause goes on. In Skilebex's case, it was they felt forgiven by the one whom they had betrayed and denied and so on. And so they invented these stories of the empty tomb and apparitions to express the symbolic fact that they were bearers of this living tradition, you know. Well, I've always characterized these things as faculty lounge theories, meaning they're cooked up by people who are trying desperately to make Christianity easy to believe. But as people like Kierkegaard knew, what's easy to believe usually isn't worth believing. And I love how Kierkegaard said his purpose as a theologian was to make Christianity hard to believe, because he realized it's only a Christianity hard to believe that's worth believing. Nobody in the first century would have taken seriously a claim that, hey, believe in this guy because I think his cause was great, and he's dead and has stayed in his grave, but his teaching was really powerful. No one would have found that compelling. Think of all the faux messianic figures, most famously Bar Kokhba in the early 2nd century, who was seen by many, many Jews as the Messiah. Bar Kokhba is arrested by the Romans and then put brutally to death. Well, who remembers him now except a handful of specialist historians? The point is, it's not just the cause of Jesus going on. It's something happened to these disciples that was so overwhelming that they went all over the world they knew, and they went to their deaths. Every one of them except for John. Every one of them died declaring the truth of what they were teaching. This was not some little inner subjective experience. Who cares about that? It was something so objective and so real to them that it sent them careering around the world. I think that's something we have to come to grips with historically. Speaking of that, too, go back to N.T. Wright again. One of his claims is that on historical grounds, it's very hard to explain Christianity's endurance as a messianic movement apart from the resurrection, because the expectation was the Messiah would deal with the enemies of Israel, right? So here's someone who was done to death by the enemies of Israel, who was nailed to a Roman cross, died and buried. I mean, there's no better argument against his being Messiah than that, unless some greater power emerged and intervened, raising him from the dead and showing thereby that he did indeed defeat the enemies of Israel, but in the most unexpected way. Just explain, N.T. Wright challenges historians, just explain to me how Christianity endured as a messianic movement, even as they declared the cross. They weren't hiding it. Paul says, I preach one thing, Christ and him crucified. None of that makes sense on historical grounds apart from the resurrection.
What are some of the conclusions that we can draw from the resurrection? Or I guess to ask it more simply, what's the meaning of the resurrection?
I would say that God's love is more powerful than anything that's in the world. So it's more powerful than sin, which you see on full display in the Passion narratives. It's more powerful than Roman power, which means all forms of worldly power. Think of Pontius Pilate and Tiberius Caesar and all of them that stand for this extraordinary secular military power, which put Jesus to death. And yet he rose from the dead, showing that God's love is more powerful than even those forces. And then finally, death itself, our greatest enemy, what hovers over the whole of life in this debilitating way. God's love is greater than death. That's why it's a victory. You know, the victory of the cross is so important. If Jesus died and stayed in his grave and a few disciples thought, oh, wasn't he great? I mean, that's no victory at all, seems to me. That's no victory at all. That's like, the Abraham Lincoln Society saying, wasn't Abraham Lincoln great? As indeed he was. But no one's claiming that your whole life is transformed by Abraham Lincoln. But yet, that's the claim about Jesus. So I think that's what it means, is that God's love is victorious over anything that's in the world.
And when you read the book of Acts or the letters of St. Paul, you see him careening all over the world, proclaiming the good news that Jesus is risen from the dead. And I'm guessing that most of the people listening to this podcast probably aren't going to march around their own towns and cities and stand up with Paul's boldness and just shout, Jesus is risen. How do you recommend that we proclaim the message of Jesus' resurrection today to a culture that's mostly skeptical of anything supernatural and miraculous?
Yeah, I know it's a famously difficult question. Maybe we do need a little more of St. Paul. Maybe our preachers, there are tons of Christian preachers around, including myself, that we ought to do it with greater verve and enthusiasm Don't water it down. Don't render it symbolic. Don't use circumlocutions, but declare Jesus Christ risen from the dead. In our own lives, we declare it whenever we live utterly for God. See, because when you do that, you're saying, I'm not afraid of what's in the world. I'm not afraid of what could happen to me. I'm not afraid of what they think. I'm not afraid. Look at even the case that's all around us now. There's 4 Mother Teresa nuns in Yemen. The priest, now the reports that he'd been crucified, and some say it's not true. I'm not sure where that lies now, but there are martyrs all around us. Well, see, martyrs make sense only in light of the resurrection. Because what they're saying is, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid of your guns and your power and your threats. So that's the best preaching of the resurrection you can find, would be in the martyrs.
Talk about the significance of Christianity in general, but Jesus as a religious founder in particular, being rooted in history contra many other major religions.
Yeah, I spoke on this on Easter Sunday. I've loved the myths ever since I was a kid. I remember reading the Greek and Roman myths as a kid, and I did a little report, I remember, with pictures. And I love the Greek and Roman myths. They're beautiful. I still love them. I remember watching Joseph Campbell many years ago in his famous interview with Bill Moyers. And Campbell's this brilliant, articulator of the mythic systems of the world. And he holds to the monomyth theory that really is one great story being told, the hero's journey, et cetera, So Star Wars and everything else is the latest incarnation of the great monomyth. I love that. And I remember Campbell is like, there are 4 purposes of myth. I won't get them all right, but they explain things cosmically, explain things politically, explain things psychologically. And they do. So my point here is I'm giving an encomium to the myths. I think they're of extraordinary beauty and explanatory power. Okay, having said all that and not gainsaying even a little bit of it, Jesus is not a mythic figure. As Lewis and Tolkien and company, when Tolkien was trying to explain to Lewis, wasn't it the difference? He said, well, the Christian story is like a myth, but with the decisive difference that it really happened. It really happened in history. It's not just a hope, the articulation of a dream, of an archetypal fantasy. It happened. It's like a real myth. The incarnation, the becoming flesh, which means in space and time. It's the historical acting out, if you want, of these mythic anticipations. I like how Chesterton and many others too will see the links between Christianity and the myths. The myths are good dreams, right? The human race dreaming about what would come. When Jesus comes, you realize they all have their place now in relation to him. So it's of decisive significance that Jesus is something else, something other, which doesn't put down the myths. In fact, allows the myths to find their proper purpose.
Time now for our weekly question from our listener. Today we're hearing from Anna from Wichita, Kansas. She asked a question based on something you talked about in a prior episode on the YouTube heresies. So here's Anna's question.
Hello, Bishop Barron. This is Anna Harder from Wichita, Kansas. In your podcast on your YouTube series Against the YouTube Heresies, Part 2, you mentioned that we were teaching children Shakespeare in school, but teaching them religion through comic books. I was just wondering what would be a good way to start teaching children a little bit deeper theology. Thank you for your ministry. God bless you.
Yeah, good question. That story I've told now many times about my niece when she was reading all these serious things. And I went out and bought her Volume 1 of Thomas's Contra Gentiles. I bought her the Confessions of Augustine. Bought her Dante's Divine Comedy, and I bought her Chesterton's Orthodoxy, and I think something of maybe Bonaventure's Mind's Road to God. Start with the classics. Or I think, Lewis's Mere Christianity would be a great place to start with a young person. It's a beautifully crafted book. It's deeply true, and it's pretty accessible, I think, to a smart, even high school kid. Don't patronize our kids. Don't patronize them. They can't handle it. Well, they're handling it in every other area. I think of my nephew now who's a junior in high school, and he's doing math, at the highest levels right now. Why is he doing religion at the highest levels? Why isn't he? And he's not. I can tell you that. He's not. Why not? So I think it's our own problem. It's our own self-imposed difficulty. I would get some of these classic books, find teachers who know them and love them and can communicate to them. And don't tell me, as they're studying trigonometry in mathematics, that they can't handle G.K. Chesterton or C.S. Lewis or even Thomas Aquinas. So to me, it's a confounding problem. It's been confounding to me for years. I would encourage too, younger people looking for a career, and not just for money and status and stuff, but really to make a difference. Dedicate yourself to secondary education. Become a teacher of religion and say, I'm going to teach these kids C.S. Lewis every year. I'm going to have them read Mere Christianity. We're going to spend 3 months on Mere Christianity. And then from that, you can branch off, read all the people that influenced Lewis. To me, that'd be a really cool class. Maybe begin the junior year of high school, let's say. Begin by, we all read the Mere Christianity. Then we say, okay, where did he get these ideas from? And I'll tell you exactly. Got them from Augustine, got them from Thomas Aquinas, got them from G.K. Chesterton, who got them from Newman, And now branch out and read all the great classic figures and challenge them in religion as much as you challenge them in trigonometry and as much as you challenge them in history and physics, right? The other day I was at a deanery meeting here in my deanery of in my region of Santa Barbara, and one of the great principals came in from our grade school, and my little speech to her, she's doing great work, and I God bless her for that. I said, here's what I want as your bishop. I want religion to be the hardest class they take. I want the kids to say, man, math is tough and science, but I tell you, the hardest class we have is religion. That's what I want. So sorry for the rambling answer, but I feel strongly about it.
I'll add to that, Anna, that in episode 4 of the Word on Fire show titled Answering the Atheist, we had a related question from a young father wondering how to describe God to his young child. He didn't want to raise him with a delusional understanding of God, but at the same time, he understood he couldn't deliver the full, sophisticated idea of God to his young child. So listen to that episode. Bishop Barron offers a great response on how to progressively teach our children as they get older and fill in some of the gaps in their religious education. If you have a question for Bishop Barron, visit askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question there, and every single week we choose one question to answer right here on the show. Well, thanks again for listening to the Word on Fire show. Bishop Barron, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see everybody next week.